Hello, everyone, and welcome to another historian's interview here on the channel. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. Joining me today is another guest making her third debut here on the channel. Now, my guest today is an awesome individual. If you remember her from last year, we talked about hagiography and the study of saints. And at the time, she was in the midst of getting her doctorate. Well, it's been 1 year since that episode in June. Funnily enough, today is June as well for the month. And joining us all the way from the UK to tell us all about the new ventures, new projects, and what she's been up to in a year. Let's give a huge round of applause to Dr. Chloé Agar. Chloé, thank you so much for coming back on the channel again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me again.
Awesome. So let's start as a little refresher. So for those who may not have seen the Historian Science episode last year or did not listen to Chloé's first interview 2 years ago, Chloé, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your field of study?
Yep. Okay. So if we go all the way back, so I'm in the UK. I went through the UK school system, so I did A levels, which I know are baffling to anyone not in the UK. I did 4 subjects at A level. So I did English language, English literature, French and history. Very humanities-y. I fled maths at the earliest opportunity. I didn't do it for GCSE at 16, so I was just like, no, not doing it anymore. And then I did my undergraduate degree, so my bachelor's at Oxford, and I did that in Egyptology, much to the bewilderment of everyone. How I got into that, I mean, I knew I wanted to go to uni. So in the UK, A levels take 2 years, and you tend to apply for a university at the start of the second year. So it got to the end of the first year, and I did my exams, and then there's the kind of limbo period of that summer, and the school was getting quite hard onto us for starting to work on our university applications. I understand that's also quite a stressful process for Americans, so presumably you can feel, you can empathize.
Yes. It's
even though
not
our
easy.
systems are a little different, it sounds like it is also painful. So our school sort of identified the crop of students they thought might be Oxbridge hopefuls, and kind of shipped us off to this big event in Newcastle, where Oxford and Cambridge, well, it was effectively a roadshow. They were going around the major cities in the UK, or at least in England.
Okay.
I guess touting for business, if you want to put it like that. So we all got crammed onto a minibus and driven 2 hours up to Newcastle. And there were lots of talks on like the admissions process,
Right.
on like how student finance works in the UK, on different subjects, English, history, whatever. Very fraught day, very full. You collect all your prospectuses and your free pens and whatever else you can get your hands on. And then you all get driven on the minibus back home, very tired, very hyped up. And I didn't know what I wanted to do at university. So obviously it's kind of a problem if you want to apply.
Right.
I was convinced for many years from being quite young that I wanted to do English. So I like to joke that I just like didn't scroll far enough on the drop down menu and picked Egyptology instead. My my dear father tried in a, I don't want to say misguided, but like I did not get the message at the time.
Right.
Sort of way to make me understand that you don't have to do at university the same subjects you did at school. Like, if you want to do English or you want to do history or you want to do maths, that's awesome. Like, go for it if that's what you want to do. But there are other things out there that we don't really have necessarily on the school, like, curriculum.
Right.
So his method for this was to make me look into law degrees.
Ooh, okay.
Which I dutifully did. But, and I mean zero offense by this, but to me, law is quite dull. Like, I understand it. I think, yeah, I would be good at it if that's the path I went down. I get how my mind does work that way, which is like how Dad sold it to me. But it just doesn't infuse me as a topic.
That's fair.
I was sort of thinking, well, I still prefer English. And it was only sort of later on that I kind of got what he was trying to teach me. It's like, you could have just said it to me straight and I would have probably twigged a lot sooner. So I was just flicking through the prospectuses for Oxford and Cambridge, just like, and I found Egyptology and thought, okay, now we're talking.
Nice.
My poor parents had to deal with their daughter being like, I want to do Egyptology at Oxford. And there are so many things in that sentence that are incomprehensible to them. So yeah, I ended up at Oxford for my undergraduate degree. Undergraduate degrees in the UK are 3 years, apart from in Scotland where they're 4. Then I decided that because my undergraduate degree was quite language heavy.
Right.
And in Egyptology, there's, I'm not going to say a war, but a definite divide between philology and archaeology. The two don't tend to like each other very much.
Okay.
The early Egyptologists of the more sort of colonial era tended to be jacks of all trades. A lot of them.
Right.
And then at some point, the two kind of like severed.
Oh, no.
With apparently irreconcilable differences.
Jeez.
So I sort of thought, well, if I'm going to pursue this any further, I probably need to know a bit more about archaeology. So I decided that I was going to apply for a master's in archaeology. In the UK, if you do a master's full-time, most of the time it's 1 year. So I ended up going to Liverpool, which is another of the sort of strongholds of Egyptology in the UK.
Right.
To do an MA in archaeology. And then I had decided when I first applied to university as like before I was jaded, as an optimistic 17-year-old, that I wanted to do a doctorate. And this is partly because I wanted to do a doctorate, because I don't know, I'm ambitious and slightly mad. And also, I think this isn't the reason, because this is not a good reason to commit to the time and the money and the tears that go into a doctorate.
Yes.
My father has a master's. So I was just like, I'm going to do one better.
You want to one-up your father and get a doctorate.
I have one-upped my father to get the first doctorate in the family. So that wasn't the sole justification, but it does make it very satisfying.
Wow. I mean, still, that's a huge accomplishment to get like a doctorate in your field, which then kind of leads into, the next set of questions, or the beginning part of the question. So for you, Chloe, when you got your doctorate, or actually when you enrolled into your doctoral program. I don't know how different it is here in the States to the UK. So when you applied for your doctoral degree, what were some of like the specifications you had to uh, do to not only be accepted into the doctoral program, but what did sort of you expect in your field for the doctorate degree? Because I would imagine, regardless of like being in the UK and being in the US, you now are working on a project that you are passionate about, and you have to present a thesis and research behind it. So, can you tell us about that stage of your life at that time?
Yeah. So yeah, doctorates. This is based on my understanding from American friends who either did their doctorate in the US or, having done their masters here, have fled back to the US and now started a doctorate.
Right.
I'm thinking of a friend I have at Notre Dame who I think is in the, I want to say, second year of her PhD now. I can't quite remember. Or maybe she's still in her first year. But I understand, I don't know if it's all PhD programs, I don't want to generalize, but I understand that a lot of PhD programs over in the States, there's like a few years of still like taking classes and doing exams and that kind of stuff.
To my knowledge, yes, that is kind of true, at least from my field, especially in history, where if you were in your master's program and you want to pursue your thesis, you want to pursue your doctorate, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, viewers, it's been like now like 2 years since I was in school, but if you've been working on a thesis since your undergrad and your graduate and you want to elevate it to your doctoral program, you had to show, okay, here's what I'm working on. Here's the committee that's going to be with me. Because that's an important thing, viewers and listeners. In like graduate school, you have to have a committee who's going to evaluate you. Either you do the thesis, or if you do the master's exam, which both are still very, very challenging and difficult. But one, in opinion, is easier than the other, and that being the master's exam, because it's more so of writing essays based on your research, whereas your thesis, you have to defend it to your committee, who are experts in the field, whatever you go into. So is that kind of the same way for you, Chloe, when you went into your doctorate degree?
It's not a million miles off. So for us, we don't have that kind of taught bit of a doctorate degree. We go straight into the research bit.
Okay.
So our kind of, I guess, analogy for American PhDs is you kind of do another master's first, and then you get into the doctoral research bit, is how we kind of, I don't know, understand what is going on.
Right.
And so it takes you guys like somewhere between 5 and 7 years.
Yes, that is accurate.
Understand. For us, it takes about 4. Because we're kind of hitting the ground running, I suppose.
Yes, I would imagine.
So, I mean, it's different in the sciences and a little bit in the social sciences. So archaeology is like in a weird mid-ground from what I've seen. Whereas in the sciences, you kind of apply to join a research project that already exists. So there's the lead investigator, some senior, academic, and you're all in a lab, and you're doing your own thesis, but if your thesis contributes also in part to whatever the lab project is.
Right.
So it's semi your own thing, but also semi someone else's thing.
Right. Okay.
And I know that can also happen for archaeology. There's a colleague I was actually in a meeting with earlier today who's, I think, advertised for a couple of PhD positions. So that's a project they have already secured funding for, and they have funding for 2 people to do PhDs working on something relevant to that project.
Man.
In the, I don't want to say like pure humanities, but like the further from the STEM end of the spectrum that you get,
Right.
You apply with your own project, and it's a very independent exercise. So a lot of STEM people find it quite, I don't know, hard to comprehend. Because you're not in a group all having lab meetings every week and, you know, going through sort of collective pain. You're very much on your own and have to kind of be self-motivated. So, I mean, I found it very challenging to write my proposal. So part of the application process, which I'm sure is the same in the States, is you have to write a proposal of, this is what I would do my thesis on.
Yes, 100%.
I could see in my proposal kind of the I don't know, the fertilized seed of what I ended up working on. But a lot has changed. Or a lot changed between that and what I ended up producing. So it's not like a legally binding,
right,
you have to definitely do this. And I mean, I was going back to Oxford, and I'm slightly backwards in how I view universities, because like Oxbridge is weird. It's Harry Potter world. Like, it's weird. It's these old buildings. It's got a load of its own traditions. It's got a load of its own really language for things. The way it structures and just deals with degrees is not normal for the UK. But having been in that system first, this is what I find comfortingly familiar. And to me, normal universities in the UK, which are like all the other universities, however many we have, are weird. So I, in some ways, kind of felt like I was applying to go back into something familiar, which is nice. It was also going to be unfamiliar because I was applying to be in a different faculty. Egyptology as a subject lives in what is now called the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies faculty.
Right.
Whereas for my doctorate, I went to the history faculty.
Oh, okay.
And these two faculties, my personal bugbear, if you want to call it, is that the history faculty, like, I get that sort of, if you like, Eastern stuff is the remit of Asian and Middle Eastern studies, hence the name. But where there should be overlap with history, because I mean, history is a pretty all-encompassing.
It is. It really can go into like any of the other like subfields, like anthropology and archaeology.
Exactly. History at Oxford, the impression I got when I started my doctorate, you know, so my application was successful. The impression I got when I started was that if it wasn't the Latin West, the history faculty wasn't really interested.
Interesting.
Which is ironic because I work on Coptic. Which is a very Egyptian and therefore not Latin West thing. Speaking, having kind of been grouped in, so history is kind of, it's subdivided at Oxford because there's quite a lot of people working on a lot of different periods and a lot of different places, and it can get a bit bewildering. So I was in the earliest subsets, which is late antique and Byzantine studies.
Right.
The next subset chronologically is medieval.
Right.
Right, makes sense. All the way down to modern 20th century stuff. But like, having been kind of grouped with the Byzantinists were not a large cohort. There were 4 of us starting our doctorates.
Really?
At the same time, full time. And so even though we were kind of administratively a different problem, because that was our subset, that was our designated bit. We kind of, for convenience, got lumped in with the medievalists, which, I mean, it meant there were more people to talk to, because there were like twice or thrice the number of medievalists.
But the field is,
Yes,
medieval Byzantium, you could talk about it, but you're more of like late antiquities, early medieval period.
Yeah, so the medievalists, we called it the DPhil. So Oxford is also weird because, and Cambridge does not do this, but we call PhDs DPhils, which to me is quite satisfying because Bachelor of Arts, Master of Arts, Doctor of Philosophy, it's the right way round, whereas PhD is actually the wrong way round, and I find that very annoying.
That's us for here on the stage. We go by the PhD.
Yeah, everyone else goes by the PhD. Oxford is just weird. This is not a British phenomenon. This is an Oxford phenomenon. So sometimes I just say I have a PhD because it saves about 10 minutes of conversation when you're meeting someone. And it's the same thing. But like, so we called it the DPhil Creche. And it was like this group seminar thing that we had on Friday mornings in the first year of my doctorate, which is probably the closest thing we got to like what Americans would have as sort of classes early on in their PhD. There wasn't an exam in it or anything. It was just kind of enforced social time.
Right.
But it was very preferential towards the medievalists, partly because it was being convened and led. Like it was the baby or the pet project of an extremely senior medievalist professor.
Right.
So makes sense, but it was very hard to understand why she had kind of co-opted the Byzantinists in. And the Byzantinists, like the fact that the senior lecturers who were Byzantinists did not quite understand this, never mind the students. And I mean, like, it wasn't helped that she was openly hostile to anything that was not the Latin medieval West. And it's like,
really?
I understand that is your field. She was a Latin West medieval specialist and clearly very good at that. Like,
really? Okay.
But she seemed to be one of those people who finds things that don't fit into their personal bubble a threat. And it's like, lady, I am not a threat to you. One, by the time I am possibly going to get a professorship, you will be long gone, because you are quite elderly. But two, we're not, even if we were in any position to be in competition with each other, I work on stuff that is so different to you. Like, you could just sit and chill and shut up and be open-minded. Like, this, I am not a threat to you, and yet somehow you're being hostile. I do not understand this. Which is obviously extremely off-putting and demoralizing when you're being laid into, both privately and in front of the rest of the group, by this very senior person who is kind of worshipped by the medievalists, as in those students in the room, because she taught a lot of them for their masters. So they were kind of like her little fan group, if you like. And you get the impression this is all very important, and she actually has a say in like whether you pass the first year of your doctorate, because like you do have to pass various points. It's not just go for 4 years and we'll see what happens. They do check in on you. And then to sort of realize she has no say. Like, administratively, there's some things in like the testing you have to go through in the first year that she conveniently had a bit of a hand in organizing.
Right.
So you had some idea what was going on, but beyond that, she had no purpose from my point of view. Like, I could have just not gone to her like little creche. It was meant to be a seminar series, but we called it a creche. It would have made no difference at all. But like, it makes you feel quite like you don't really know anything. Because all the medievalists in the room are talking about the Carolingians and the Merovingians from like medieval Gaul.
Right.
And you're sitting there like, I have no idea what these people are talking about. Like, I do not have a history degree per se. I have an Egyptology degree. I don't know what Gaul's got going on for it. I don't know what Charlemagne's up to. And then eventually you kind of figure out that if you were talking about the stuff that you know about, they would have exactly as little idea as you do about the Merovingians and the Carolingians in Gaul. And that makes you feel slightly better. It's like,
wow.
these people know nothing. I could talk about the Council of Chalcedon and they would have no idea what I was talking about.
That's really, really fascinating. And really, like, that is completely different from how it is, like in the States. Like, for me, when I went for my master's in history, I was an IDS major. My bachelor's in Asian studies. When I went to the history field at San Francisco, I went in there thinking, okay, what am I actually going to do? Because I had to choose a discipline by like the middle of my first year, like my last semester of my my first year, and I had to choose. Okay, it's not going to be as much as I love Asian studies. There wasn't a lot of Asian studies classes, history classes that I could take, but I loved Rome. I loved classical antiquity, so I decided, okay, I'm going to change my direction. I'm going to be a classical antiquities historian. And that's when all the classes came about. And by the time of my last semester, I had seminars which range from medieval Spain, which I had to take, Western, late Western Roman Empire history and early medieval history, ancient Chinese history, which was fun. But it's very interesting where we were all clumped together in a class. Like, you had people who were medievalists, Byzantines, antiquities, modern historians, all that stuff. Really, we knew very little like other stuff, but we all had to take it. So that is very fascinating from what you're talking about, which then kind of leads into heavy hitter, Chloe. So for you in that moment, we're kind of feeling like, the odd one out, the odd duck in like the beginning part of your PhD journey where you and the other Byzantines were clumped in with the medievalists and really didn't know, okay, I get it. We're not in like the Latin West, but we are still important, which is a discussion like the Byzantines, who are kind of like in the middle. They're not solely Western European, but they're not tied to the Islamic Asiatic world of Central Asia. They're like in the middle. So that could be, in a sense, deflating. And I would imagine you may have had voices of like imposter syndrome in the back of your head during your journey getting your PhD. And that's hugely deflating to anyone in any field. So for you, Chloe, with even those voices in your head, what disciplined you to get your PhD because you wanted to get your PhD and you wanted to get it in the field that you're very passionate about because you believe this is an area of study that often gets overlooked and does not get enough scholarship?
Yeah, so as I was in the history faculty and they had to put up with me for the duration of my doctorate. The discipline that I kind of fit into changes depending on who's asking.
Right.
I imagine I've probably said that to you before, maybe. So like it, because what I do is stuff that a lot of people, even within broadly surrounding fields, either haven't heard of or have heard of but know basically nothing about.
Right.
So you kind of got to do a bit of PR. So Sometimes I call myself an Egyptologist because Coptic as a language is an Egyptian phenomenon.
Right.
So what I do, despite being late antiquity rather than the sort of ancient Egypt everyone thinks about, is it's still Egyptian history. I was asked in a job interview whether I considered Coptology, which is the study of Coptic stuff, to be part of Egyptology or a separate thing. And my answer was that it's part of Egyptology. To me, it's a subdiscipline because it's still Egyptian history and Egyptian language. It's just later.
Right.
Which seemed to please the academic asking the question. So I think that was the right answer as well. But so sometimes I say I'm an Egyptologist, sometimes I go more specific and say I'm a Coptologist if you're in an environment of people who are familiar with the idea of what on earth Egyptology is, to kind of narrow it down.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I might say I'm a historian, but we need to keep it nice and broad. Sometimes I call myself a Byzantinist, which really upsets the other Byzantinists because they don't know what on earth I'm doing. They're all hovering around Constantinople and Trebizond. And I'm just chilling down in the middle of Egypt, like, hey guys. So yeah, it's very audience dependent.
Right.
But what I do is say Coptic is the latest or final phase of the Egyptian language. But instead of writing it with pretty pictures,
okay.
They use letters.
Right.
Which is somewhat of a downgrade. I've spent the last week at a summer school in Oxford. I did not travel far. On Anatolian languages and linguistics, which is like miles off what I actually do in time and place. Ancient Anatolia is like BC and I am AD.
Right.
It's contemporary to like the periods of ancient Egyptian history I really like. So like Tutankhamun and Ramesses the Great.
Right.
That kind of period. But like it was interesting, particularly there was a set of classes, lectures on writing systems that were used in ancient Anatolia, and turns out they had multiple, which is bewildering,
right.
But cool. They had their own set of hieroglyphs, and I was slightly heartened by the fact that people who were not like already hardcore Anatolian studies people were finding the concept of how hieroglyphs work very confusing. And I was just sitting there like, I have no idea what any of that gibberish on the board says, because it's a totally different system.
Right.
Totally different symbols and what have you. And a completely unrelated language. It's Indo-European, Egyptian is Afro-Asiatic. But like, I get the basic principle of what you're explaining to me, and it sounds like it works in the same way. So I'm cool with that. Cuneiform, no idea. Never studied it. Wouldn't know where to start. But they also had alphabets. It was like the whole thing just going on at the same time. So Coptic Egyptian is generally divided into 5 phases. There's also like Proto-Egyptian or something like that.
Right.
Which I never ventured into. I don't really do pre-dynastic. I do slightly later. And because like many academics, particularly the sort of colonial West, have zero imagination when naming things, the first 3 phases are Old, Middle, and Late Egyptian.
Yeah, I've seen that in a lot of books that I have right beside me.
Then you get Demotic, which is the world's worst writing system, as far as I'm concerned. Grammatically, it is very straightforward. It is virtually the same as Late Egyptian, and by extension, virtually the same as Coptic, but not a huge amount changes grammatically between them. I just hate the writing system, because you have your pretty hieroglyphs, which everyone has seen. The Egyptians also had a cursive version, so the version you would write your laundry list in.
Right.
Sadly, they did not do that in hieroglyphs, which obviously we as children probably did, because that's cool and fun. The cursive version is called hieratic. Demotic as a script is derived from hieratic, so it's basically cursive, which sucks as far as I'm concerned. All dematists are weird in my mind for having the patience or the sheer terrifying intellect to be able to read that. And then Coptic comes later, and it uses like an adapted version of the Greek alphabet.
Okay.
But it is still Egyptian, apart from the Greek loanwords, which they often misspell, which upsets classicists so much. It is glorious. It's quite funny watching classicists try to get to grips with Coptic. It is not well, I don't know. To me, it isn't a particularly complicated language, but one, I've been using it for years, and two, I'd already been studying Egyptian when I started to study it, so maybe it is hard. I don't know.
Right.
There's two, I like to think of schools of people who end up learning Coptic. One tends to do a lot better than the other. That's not to say it's not possible for it to be the other way around. So I have seen it be the other way around as well. But as a kind of general rule, Egyptologists coming to Coptic tend to do all right, because once they've got the hang of the alphabet, like, the grammar isn't particularly new. So once you start to figure out, oh wait, this is like a version of that grammatical construction. Okay, cool. Or once you sound it out, you're like, oh yeah, it's that word, which I've obviously seen written very differently before. Okay, this is fine. Classicists tend to struggle more. It's like, I've seen some classicists, there's someone here at Oxford who was just like auditing the Coptic class when I was taking it as an undergraduate. And she is very much classicist, but she was very good, like annoyingly good. Whereas the other classicists in the class kind of struggle. I was the only one who actually had to be in the class. I was the only one doing the exam. Everyone else was there for the fun of it. But because most of the letters, barring 7-ish, are just versions of the Greek letters, they just pick either the uppercase or the lowercase of each Greek letter and roll with it.
Fascinating.
So, like, for instance, they normally write gamma that way.
Right.
But they normally write beta. They normally write sigma. So because it's a mostly familiar alphabet, because there are a decent number of Greek loanwords, however butchered,
Yes.
in Coptic texts, classicists tend to think this is going to go well. Or they tend to assume it's Greek. It is
Right.
not.
No.
It isn't even remotely related. Greek is Indo-European. It's more closely related to Farsi and Sanskrit than it is, like, Egyptian is from a totally different language family. So there isn't even the sort of similarity of two different, but nonetheless both Indo-European languages. If I kind of see the logic that's going on here.
Right.
So they tend to come unstuck quite quickly if they can't sort of get that idea out of their head that, oh, this is just Greek, right? And then you start reading stuff and they're like, oh my God, this is nothing like Greek. It's like, correct.
Definitely, definitely. And that kind of leads into something that you mentioned earlier about, the audience, which I think now is a perfect segue into the business side about being an historian, because I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on it, Chloe, where I'm sure you would definitely agree. It's probably made the same in the States, where unless you're in like the upper tiers of the historian job record, like a public historian, state historian, working in like the top museums in whatever county you're in, either London, Oxford. I'm going to use an old Anglo-Saxon term because I don't know the other part, East Anglia or Anglian. But all of those places probably have like incredible museums, and they always look for the people who are the best in their field. And for a first-time historian getting out into the job market, it's a little intimidating. Even with all the knowledge that we have, experience is always, very key. As well as, okay, who's the audience that I'm really going to connect with when I present my research in the job market? Because as historians, we're pretty much like freelancers in the sense that we literally have to make our own brand, our own identity in the field, because it's a very competitive field, especially just starting out. So for you, Chloe, when you got your doctorate degree, when you finally finished the years of schooling and you realize, yes, I'm now a doctorate in the field that I've worked so hard in, and then the realization dawns when you're like, okay, now what am I going to use this the most to help benefit me and the field? And that again comes to the audience. So how important is it for you and for like generally Egyptologists to understand, their audience? And for you in particular, when you started, searching to best suit your field of history, how important was it for you to understand, okay, who is my audience? Not so much the field's audience, but my audience, what I'm able to bring to the field of Egyptology, as well as Byzantium studies and Coptics.
It's tricky because, like, in the UK, I think it's similar in other places, like in the US and on the continent. But there's an increasing sort of rabid emphasis on impact.
Right.
So you have to think a lot about how you're, not to be kind of, I don't know, cold and heartless about it, but selling.
Right.
What you're doing. Particularly in the humanities. STEM kind of has assumed value, whereas the humanities is just being decimated in terms of funding.
Yes, I wanted to agree. It's same here in the States. It's like really tough, and I'm sure you definitely agree, Clay, that many people would say, what's the purpose of the humanities, like for history and literature and all the other fields that don't really have guaranteed or set employment opportunities.
Yeah, like it's weird because like a lot of school students, a lot of people thinking about their university like options and what have you now are genuinely very interested in like the ancient world, language, humanities-y stuff. Doesn't have to be precisely what I do. I will, foster enthusiasm wherever. And yet there are universities that are closing down their different faculties within the humanities. And it's just like, guys, you're missing an entire market. Especially with like tuition fees are a thing in this country. Like, just leave the department open and just hoover those students up, surely.
Right.
universities are killing their archaeology or their ancient language faculties, and it's just like, why? Kids are into that. You want to encourage that. I was like, for use, I think part of the problem is we set up a competition between STEM and the humanities.
Okay.
And then, the government obviously plays into this by increasing or decreasing funding, what have you. Universities play into that, they make their choices. But, like, both are useful.
Yes,
I mean,
100%.
perhaps the usefulness of STEM is more blatant. Is you have your physics, you have your medicine, you have your engineers. My father's an engineer. My father is very STEM. Like, he's very mathsy. He is the reason I got a top grade in my maths GCSE. His very patient attempts to tutor me through how to do different maths problems. But the humanities it teaches you to think in a different way to how STEM teaches you to think.
Right.
Which is equally valuable. And I think I don't want to generalize STEM, because, as we've established, I am a very hardcore humanities person by background.
Right.
But humanities, to me, seems to be more flexible in terms of where you might go after what you've done.
Right.
I guess my personal issue with it is a lot of the fields that people who have either done undergraduate or also postgraduate degrees in the humanities go into that aren't academia, and actually pay half decently, are fields I do not want to end up in. And it's a bit like my feelings about law. It's not that I think, oh my God, that's awful and morally reprehensible and how dare you go into that field. It's more just, that's not what I'm personally interested in, but good for you. So a lot of humanities people end up in law, regardless of if they've ever actually studied law. They end up in the civil service. They end up teaching in schools. And none of these things are like top of my radar for things I want to do.
Right.
But in the humanities, you also have the heritage sector, which I think is really cool and interesting and would be happy to invest in. The problem is the funding is just getting sapped out of it like everything else. But within heritage and academia are quite closely entwined, at least around here, because most of the museums in the city are affiliated with the university. So again, there's this huge emphasis on impact in order to get funding out of anyone. You have to be able to prove that your audience consists of a range of different groups, diversity, right?
Right.
And that, you're not just, if you're a university museum like the Petrie at UCL, the Fitzwilliam at Cambridge, the Ashmolean here, you're not just serving the academics in the university, but you're also serving the community, be that within the city or more internationally. So there's kind of two-pronged impact thing going on, of you have to be available for academics to work with the collections, but you also have to be available for the public, school children, whatever.
Right.
And a lot of that boils down to outreach.
Yes, definitely.
Which I have done and do a lot of, and I enjoy it. Like, when I say I don't want to be a school teacher, it's not that I don't enjoy teaching. I enjoy teaching very much. is that I do not want to work in a school environment, which is my personal preference. Partly because if you do outreach, you can give the kids back afterwards.
Yes.
There is very little admin involved, and very little disciplinary responsibility. But what I also like doing, which relates to the impact thing, is introducing audiences. I mean, I do a lot of work with school students because those are the opportunities that have been presented to me. Those are the opportunities I have found and been hired for and what have you. And in Oxford, a lot of that is targeting groups that don't normally, or that are not necessarily well represented among particularly the undergraduate population. Be those ethnic groups or be those groups from certain parts of the country. Like, there are conscious efforts to basically show these groups of kids that Oxbridge is a possibility. You don't have to be a straight white guy from Eton to be within a chance of getting in, or to like have a chance of having an enjoyable experience. But part of what I like to do is show whatever audience I have in an outreach capacity, normally teenagers, but not always, what kind of things exist beyond the curriculum. It's basically the message my father was trying to teach me, but I try to be a bit more blatant about it. So
Right.
like, that could be, I do outreach with the history faculty. So obviously if they've got me doing an outreach thing, I am here representing not the Latin medieval West, so there. But for the third year in a row now, I've been doing outreach at Pembroke College, which is one of the various colleges, there's 40 odd of them, which has this like year-long outreach program that it does with students in the first year of their A-levels. And part of that is they write essays for a competition. Part of that is they attend online lectures. They attend a week-long summer school at the college. So I've been teaching on that. And like, in that capacity, like, I'm happy to wax lyrical to the students about history, but the kind of subject group I am in for that is called Philosophy and World Religions.
Okay.
And I applied, when I first applied to be a tutor on this program, I didn't pick history because I was like, everyone is going to pick history. Like, history is going to have a lot of applicants. Yes. I'm going to pick, as my father calls it, the weird one, which is the story of my life. I do the weird thing no one else thought of. So I was like, well, Christianity, we as people from the UK and the US might think that's not very exotic. We come from majority Christian countries. But I market it as, well, this is a denomination, this is a church that a lot of people haven't heard of. It's got its own thing going on, it's got its own traditions, its own history, and its base is in North Africa and the Middle East. So that's the world part, right?
Right.
So I applied with that gambit and succeeded. So the students that I get on that program, some of them want to do history or English, you know, mainstream, I guess, things, which is cool, which is fine. And some of them want to do philosophy, some of them want to do theology. But I like the variety. Like, when you actually talk to the kids and you're like, so why are we here on philosophy and world religions? What direction are you coming at this from? and you find out what they're considering maybe applying for a uni. That's nice. But I enjoy that because what I do, despite the diversifying of topic options available for GCSE and A-level history in the UK because of the whole drive for decolonisation. So there's more and more, I don't want to call them exotic topics, but there's a bigger range. So, you can study Mao's China, for example. You can, and you study, if it's a British Empire related topic, you get more perspectives in it. So it's like the kind of proliferation of topics is happening, but what I work on is still very much not a thing in the UK curriculum. If Egyptian history comes up, it's in the context of ancient Egypt, which tends to get covered at primary school.
Right.
So, like, up till the age of 11. But, like, the existence of Christianity in the East, let's say, is still not really covered. Egyptian history any further forward in time is not really covered. Middle Eastern history gets a nod, but only from sort of the context of the Gulf War onwards.
Wow.
So, very recent. To make ends meet, I private tutor GCSE and A-level students because that's where the money is. Not to be mercenary about it. But one of my students going into the second year of their A-level is going to be studying sort of one of the few Middle Eastern topics, if not the only one. I don't want to say it's the only one because then someone's going to find another one. One of the few topics sort of on the menu, which is like the Ottomans to the Gulf War, basically, or to the US invasion of Iraq. Which obviously is slightly disturbing for me because I'm just like, if it was in my lifetime, it's not history. I'm sorry. I don't like it. So studying from sort of World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire up to what to me kind of, I get that it's history, but I also feel like it shouldn't count as history yet. But beyond that, and the possibility of studying Mao era China, the East doesn't get a massive look in.
Right.
Really? So I'm just like, look, there's other cool stuff. And that's kind of what I like to do with my impact. And if someone would hire me, like a full-time job, to do that, I think I would be quite content with that. Like, I think I would find that fun. It's like teaching, but not like heavy admin school teaching. Different groups of kids, other audiences, and getting to enthuse about whatever it is I do.
Definitely. And what you talked about brought up a really important question that I'm really excited to ask you before I get into the last few questions of the interview, Chloe. And this is a big one. So I'm going to give context for this one. So I've said it numerous times on the show, but for those who don't know, I had a guest last year. Her name was Natalie Wright, author of Season of the Dragon. And when I spoke with her, she discussed with me that her book that's been the talk of the town at the LA Festival of Books where I met her, as well as online, which was her 7th book. I understood or misunderstood and believed that to be her first book. She said, no, that is not my first book. I wrote many books before, but none of them really hit the market. My 7th book got my name out, and that's where she dropped a pearl of wisdom, which I wholeheartedly feel applies to historians and people who are in the humanities field, which is the biggest danger anyone could believe is that their debut anything is going to be the start of their legacy, be it an author or be it an historian fresh out of university. And that leads into two very important things at that moment, which is, do you want to be this or do you want to be known as this? Because those two have very different goals and very different objectives. To be known as an historian, you are providing, in a way, like a service. You are providing information to the next generation of people to preserve history. Want to be known as an historian is where you want to make a career and be the historian that's featured in the documentaries, be hired as a consultant and stuff like that, which definitely takes work. But to believe that your debut, anything's going to be the start of your legacy, is detrimental for anyone, be it author or historian, because you're chasing trends and clicks, which exists in the historian community. I'm going to say it right here. In the historian community, there are fields that are given more scholarship than others, and not to give bash to those fields of study, but it's to make people aware that even in the field of history, just as Chloe's mentioned, there are areas of study which are more talked about than other aspects, and that may be due to media, books that have been written about them or have been written in that era that is researched. And of course, that is entirely detrimental to any first-time historian getting out of university, because we may have our rise, we fall, we rise again, we fall down even hard. And that voice of imposter syndrome comes back with a vengeance, and then it comes back to what were your long-term goals with this field. I know for myself, when I got out of university, I initially wanted to go into the museum aspect, but I had no experience. Now I write history because I love writing. That's another aspect of my passion. And I realize that's where I see myself possibly for the long term, is to write about history. So for you, Chloe, this is a very big one. And I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this before I go to the final question, which is, in your opinion, how important is it for, a first-time historian to understand that their debut anything is not going to be the start of their legacy, but it should not deter them from studying and pursuing history if that is indeed their passion?
I think you make a very good point with, well, two things. One, do you want to be the thing, or do you want to be known for being the thing? And how those two can be quite different. And also the idea of a debut thing. And I think that's a thing that is really hard to acknowledge. I think particularly because we're in an environment where we see success all the time, but we don't see failure. Whether you're looking at a film star or a recording artist, your classic celebrity, or whether you're looking at an author or an academic, you only see the big names.
Yes.
And you only see them once they're successful anyway. So it is extremely difficult to retain a sense of perspective. My mother keeps pointing out to me, and this is slightly skewed because I am the baby among all my cousins. Most of my cousins are in their 40s, have kids, the whole caboodle, and I'm not 30 yet. Like, most of my cousins are 15 years older than me. Most of my cousins are the same age as one of my doctoral supervisors, which really weirds out that supervisor. Like, it weirds him out that my parents are less than 5 years younger than his, even though he's 15 years old.
Oh, jeez.
He was just like, wait, what? How old are you? Blew the poor man's mind. So I think I have a slightly skewed perspective of how time and age kind of work, because I'm so used to being surrounded by people who are so much older than I am.
Right.
So I'm constantly being like, I don't have time to do anything. I'm old. I'm 28. I'm not old. Yeah, I have peers and friends in the same kind of weird limbo state as me, having finished their doctorates in all sorts of fascinating things, who hate me because I'm not 30 yet. I finished my doctorate at 26. Like,
I'm
I have no
27, so
idea what I'm doing next.
I completely agree with that.
And I think perspective is hard. And my mother keeps saying to me, "You're still really young. You got time to figure it out." But like, you're getting the mixed messages, just like in the world in general, of you're really young. You have time to figure out your life, and oh my God, you have to do it now. And it's hard to not get panicked.
Right.
By that. I think my other doctoral supervisor was like, "I don't know why young people are in such a rush." She's a bit older than my other supervisor. And she was just like, "I don't know why people are in such, take your time, it's fine." Yeah, very chilled and laid back. I think those are important things to think, and I think perspective is very difficult to have when you're in an environment, when you're in it. You need distance, but obviously distance means taking time off or trying to find a job in a different field or having a break and not making any money. And all of those things are absolutely terrifying and possibly a bit dangerous if you don't have a lot of money in the bank. So it's very difficult to get perspective. And in the academic environment here, I don't know how representative it is of, the rest of the UK or the rest of the world. But you're constantly being bombarded with two totally conflicting messages of one being, hey, if you want to leave academia, good for you. I've had I think I'm very fortunate that neither of my supervisors, in the nicest possible way, care. Like, they're both lovely people and they both care very much, but they don't care whether I go into academia or not. They're both like, you do what you want. I mean, one of them, he was like, well, I've had loads of supervisees leave academia. Like, I'm not offended, basically.
Right.
Which is very reassuring. And I've seen other faculty members. I mean, Byzantine studies is sort of weirdly straddles multiple faculties. It's archaeology, it's classics, it's history. Modern and medieval languages has a few people in it. Asian and Middle Eastern studies does. I've had, academics, with permanent jobs. In the field of Byzantine studies, be like, I totally get it. I totally get why you're in two minds. Like, damn, you do you, basically. But on the other hand, you're getting bombarded with the message that now you've done your doctorate, you are now qualified to be an academic, in essence. Now you've done that. If you leave, you're a failure. So you have people in one ear going, do whatever, you want with your life. Good for you, which is a great message. And in the other ear, you've got the message that inspires the imposter syndrome and inspires the feeling that one ought to keep trying, even though the job market is terrible and it's soul destroying.
Yeah.
So at this point, I mean, whenever anyone asks how it's going, like at the summer school, there was someone I knew there, and she was like, "How's it going?" I was like, "Oh, I'm in the middle of an existential crisis." Because yes, making it as an academic would be nice, but the probability of that happening is so low, and there are so few jobs, and there are so many people apply to the few jobs that exist. And selection panels don't seem to have an awareness that, no, you're not fortunate enough to be able to sit there churning out publications, because that's all they care about.
Right.
They care about your publication record. Your teaching record, they're not so fussed about. Your anything else they're nowhere near as bothered about. But that's the hardest thing to sort of find the time to do. And in one sense, yeah, you just have to knuckle down and get on with it, unfortunately. But in the other sense, it's like the things that actually might land you a job as an academic, so publishing mainly, churning out research, all of that, that doesn't actually pay anything.
Doesn't.
Like I said to my parents, this ridiculous thing is, in any other field, I'm sure there are exceptions, but in any other field, what I do day to day and what I get paid to do are the same thing. Because that makes sense, right?
Right, it does.
Whereas what I am paid to do, because, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have inherited wealth. Like, I don't have a wealthy partner who's off earning goodness knows how much money a year who can, fund me desperately scrabbling to do things. Like, what I do for a living is not the academic stuff. And some selection panels do kind of, they're human beings and they kind of get that, but a lot of them are so established they don't appreciate that. And part of that will be that I guess things have changed since they were my age, as things do.
Right.
But part of it is just this total lack of empathy and this total unwillingness to change expectations. And it's like, yeah, I don't have very much by way of publications out, but I'm working on it. Like, it's a slow process, but I had a co-authored article published in March. That's a thing. I'm submitting a chapter to an edited volume at the end of next month, provided I finish editing it. And I'm going to be involved in editing another edited volume over the next however many months. So it's like, there is stuff. I'm at that really awkward, if I am to continue to pursue academia, that awkward career stage of there's stuff in the pipeline, but nobody cares about that. They care about, the deliverables being on the table. So it's like, in a year's time, I'll probably, look a lot better from a hiring committee's point of view. So yeah, it's difficult, and yet it's very hard to remember that your debut whatever is, it may be awesome and woohoo, the public may lap it up, in which case great. But chances are not that high, and that's okay. And the whole job hunt is very demoralizing, but on the flip side, the prospect of leaving academia, toxic as it can be, for something unfamiliar is also terrifying. Yeah, you sort of think, okay, if I want to leave academia, what do I actually want to do? What?
Right.
I have no idea. So, yeah.
That's
that the question.
That actually does, and that actually leads to like the final question of the interview, Chloe, which is, so with everything that you've learned and everything that you've said in this interview from your personal experiences, how the committee approaches history and like the applicants and all that stuff, with everything you've gone through, the fires and the flames, the obstacles, the grit, what is your word of wisdom to fellow historians or people who want to get into the humanities field? What is your word of wisdom to them?
Tricky. I think, for fear of repeating what someone else may have said before me, which is not all that helpful, I was right near the start of my doctorate, I was helping at an open day, which was sort of master's students who were thinking about applying for doctorates. And I remember describing my trajectory to one of those students as sideways. Because a lot of people go in a very straight route through whatever it is they do. So I think you may have an appreciation for a more sideways route if you come from having originally studied Asian stuff and ended up doing late antique and Byzantine stuff. My degree titles are backwards. Most people would start in something general like history.
Right.
And get more specialized as they go. I think this friend I was speaking to at the summer school last week, that's what her trajectory has been. Started off in history, has ended up doing something really weird and niche and Anatolian in the classics faculty. Good for her. Whereas I started in Egyptology, then went to archaeology, then went to history. And through that, I've sort of ping-ponged through different universities and different faculties, and in Oxford, different colleges. I'm not saying I have found my niche. Say I'm having an existential crisis right now. But I think a word of wisdom would be to not be afraid of, not be put off of, not to deliberately avoid going sideways, if that is a route that you want to take, or a route that would enable you to get where you want to be. Like I say, I'm not... In a year's time, I may feel differently, but right now, I'm getting increasingly put off the idea of staying in academia. I may swing violently the other way in a few months. Who knows? But I still think kind of that sideways trajectory is useful. One, it's different, it's interesting, it makes you look more fun on a CV.
Right.
Hey, we need anything we can get, right? But also, there's a lot of valuable different skills, different pools of knowledge, for the, not wanting to sound mercenary about it, but different networks involved in all these things. And while from the academic point of view, I am having a massive existential crisis, like I lost the support and all respect for certain mentors I have had for a long time, unfortunately, because of how they've treated me in the last sort of year, which is one of the reasons I'm getting put off staying in academia, and that's sort of contributed to a sort of the spiraling existential crisis. But on the flip side, I kind of have a weirdly diverse network of people in all sorts of weird different things. Like I study the early Christian world. I'm sort of mid first millennium AD to very early second millennium AD, and yet I am co-authoring the introduction to a volume on ancient Egyptian and ancient Nubian graffiti. Still not sure how that's happened, but okay, I'll take it. And I have found the chief editor of the volume, with whom I will be co-authoring said introduction, to be an extremely supportive mentor. And I'm not saying I'm going to suddenly do a crazy about face and go and specialize in
apologies, viewers.
graffiti. But like, I guess having a certain diversity in what one has kind of done can lead to ending up in, I guess, unexpected places, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
It's not. It's absolutely not. And honestly, that is probably the biggest takeaway of this interview, Chloe. And we've arrived at the end of this incredible interview here on the channel. Now, before we officially end, I want to give a huge thank you to Chloe, Dr. Chloe, for coming back on the channel. Chloe, where can people find and engage with you on social media? And do you have any projects you would like to announce that you are working on right now and possibly in the near future?
Mainly I'm on LinkedIn because I'm not a very social person. I currently also have a profile on the history faculty page that will exist for the next month or so. I will find a way to make another one somewhere else. What I'm doing, well, I have this chapter that I need to finish editing that is currently 3,000 words over the limit, so we'll work on that.
I know the struggle.
Adding stuff to it and looking at it and going, oh my god. That's going to be fun. So I'm co-authoring and to some extent co-editing this volume on graffiti, which is quite bewildering, but quite fun. We had a meeting of the editors today. I would also hope to get back to co-authoring an article on the first epistle of Clement, which I know nothing about. You're probably spotting a theme here. But I was the person who was hired by the Faculty of Theology and Religion here to transcribe the Coptic manuscripts of that text. And it's on hold because we're way too busy with other things, but I would like to go back to just the article one of the bosses of that project and I had started work on, because apart from a couple of text editions in German from like the early 1900s, no one has looked at the Coptic versions, which obviously I am all for. Let's look at the thing that generally gets ignored, which is my stuff. So that's kind of what I'm taking over at the moment, and also continuing to do outreach with Pembroke, which is fun. Each year they give me slightly more things to do and slightly more responsibility, and I'm very much enjoying that as a thing.
Awesome. Awesome. I will link all that down below in the description of this video, and I urge you all to check out me and Dr. Agar's Wandering Scribe Historians episode of season 1, where he talked about Coptics and the history of hagiography, because I learned a whole bunch of stuff in that episode, and I urge you all to go and check it out, as well as check out the very first interview Chloe had on the show on Anchor. I have it linked in my bio, so make sure to check that out. Well, my viewers and listeners and fellow history buffs, thank you so much for joining us for another Historians interview. Again, a huge thank you to Dr. Agar for coming back on the show, making her third debut on the channel. And we wish her the very best of success going forward in her field of study. And who knows, maybe it's along the ways, if she is co-authoring her own book and likes to share it, you know us, we would love to discuss it here on the channel. So, Chloe, Thank you so much for coming back on the channel. I really appreciate it, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Awesome. And thank you all viewers and listeners for now 102 subscribers here on the channel. Thank you all so very much. And as always, make sure to like, subscribe, comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview. And as always, I will see you all in the next episode. Have a wonderful day.